If you are interested in a way to bake sourdough bread in a bread pan instead of a Dutch oven, then this video is for you. Hi, I'm Ron, and thanks for clicking on this video. In my home kitchen, I bake 2 loaves of sourdough bread nearly every day, and usually I use 2 large 5-quart cast iron Dutch ovens. But earlier this week, and for the first time, I baked 2 loaves using cast iron bread pans. I was so pleased with the results, I did it again yesterday and today, making this video. At the very end, I share with you some of the history and dimensions of the tools I used. Okay then, let's begin. Sometimes I feed my starter in the morning, like today. Then around noon, when the starter has doubled in volume, I mix the sourdough. Other times I feed my starter the night before, then mix the sourdough the first thing the following morning. I feed my starter from a mixture of 1/3 rye flour, 1/3 whole wheat flour, and 1/3 all-purpose flour. I keep the mixing flour in this silver number 10 can in the freezer. My 2-loaf recipe calls for 200 grams of sourdough starter, so I feed my jar, which currently contains about 50 grams of starter, 100 grams of water, and 100 grams of mixing flour for a total of 250 grams. Once it doubles in volume, about 3 to 4 hours, I'll remove 200 grams of starter for my sourdough bread recipe. Hardly a week goes by that I don't read somebody's post about losing their starter, from a jar breaking or being left in the oven and somebody using the oven not knowing a jar of starter is inside, etc. For me, the safety solution is to keep 2 or 3 jars of starter at all times. I usually keep 1 jar on the kitchen counter and 1 or 2 more in the fridge. The jar containing 250 grams of sourdough starter will sit in the proofing box with the temperature set at 82 degrees until it doubles in volume, about 3 to 4 hours. The sourdough starter has doubled in volume and it's time to mix the sourdough. I began by placing 600 grams of water in the microwave for 1 minute, which brings the water temperature up to about 90 degrees. Now I'll add 200 grams of sourdough starter, 900 grams of flour, and 20 grams of salt. This is a 70% hydration dough. After removing the 200 grams of starter, I'll return the jar containing the original amount of 50 grams of starter to the kitchen counter until the next feeding, whenever that might be. If I go longer than 3 days without making sourdough bread again, I'll put the jar of 50 grams of starter in the fridge. I use fine sea salt in my sourdough. After mixing 900 grams of flour, 600 grams of water, 200 grams of sourdough starter, and 20 grams of salt, the sourdough sits in the proofing box for 30 minutes. After wetting my hand and at 30-minute intervals, I'll perform 2 or 3 stretch and folds, followed by 2 or 3 coil folds. Then the sourdough will rest until it increases in volume by about 1/3, which will take about 2 hours after the last coil fold. On my YouTube channel, I posted a video which demonstrates in detail stretch and fold and coil fold, and I would encourage you to watch it. After the last fold, I sometimes transfer the sourdough to this container because it's easier to measure the 1/3 rise, and I spray with water the inside to prevent the dough from sticking. After stretch and fold, coil fold, and resting, the sourdough is increased in volume by about 1/3. It's time to pre-shape, shape, and place in bannetons for overnight fermentation in the fridge. I weigh each loaf to ensure they are approximately the same size. Since one of the two loaves is nearly 200 grams heavier than the other, I need to remove 100 grams of sourdough from the large loaf and add it to the smaller loaf. The two loaves have rested, and it's time for final shaping. I lightly coat the bannetons with flour to prevent the sourdough from sticking. I'm sure there are several more sophisticated methods for final shaping into an oblong shape, but this works for me. I simply fold the sourdough in half, then seal the edge. After covering the bannetons, the sourdough will go into the fridge for overnight fermentation. I want to take a moment and discuss bulk fermentation, overnight cold fermentation, and proofing. Bulk fermentation begins after mixing flour, water, salt, and sourdough starter and ends with pre-shaping. Stretch and fold and coil fold are done during the first few hours of bulk fermentation. Then the sourdough rests or proofs. It is during the resting or proofing that the dough rises, ideally about 1/3 in volume. The sourdough rises at no other time with the possible exception of a very, very small amount of rise in the fridge. The minuscule fridge rise, if at all, in the fridge, is the result of room temperature sourdough going into a very cold fridge, and taking a few minutes for the cold fridge to lower the temperature of the sourdough. The following day, when the sourdough is baked, it is taken from the fridge and within a few minutes is placed in the oven for baking. It's the following morning and time to bake the sourdough bread. Since I normally store my two large 5-quart cast iron Dutch ovens in the bottom oven, I first need to replace them with 4 cast iron bread pans. Then preheat the oven at 450 degrees for at least 30 minutes. The cast iron bread pans I use are from Camp Chef, a Utah-based company, and they cost about $22 each. The bread pans have been in the oven for an hour at 450 degrees, and the sourdough has been in the bannetons and have spent the night in the fridge. I buy parchment paper in packets of 100 for about $10 per packet, and the size is 16¼ inch by 12 3/8 inch, and when cut in half is the perfect size for the bread pans. Gloves like these are a must when handling hot cast iron. I just need to loosen the edge gently of the sourdough from the banneton so it'll release easily. And out it comes. Perfect. And this is actually the first time I've used these two bannetons. One slice all the way across and some small decorative slices on the side. Perfect. And into the bread pan. Perfect fit. And the reason I cut the end of the parchment paper, I was thinking it would help seal the lid when I place it on top. But as I later found out, it would have been better, I think, to have left the edge of the parchment paper uncut so that I could use it to lift the bread out of the bread pan. Oh well, I'll know next time. Loosening the edges of the dough again, and the parchment paper, and it slips right out. I use as little of flour as I can get by with in the bannetons. I really don't like much flour on my sourdough. And cutting off the ends again. I'm confident this will be the last time I cut the ends of the parchment paper off. Okay, into the oven they'll go, 450 degrees for 30 minutes. It's been 30 minutes. First thing I do is lower the temperature from 450 to 400 degrees before I even open the oven door, so I don't forget to lower the temperature. So it's now set at 400. This is one of the exciting parts when you take the bread out and take the lid off. It's always anticipation. Oh my, isn't that bread beautiful? And look at that amazing spring. That bread is nearly doubled its height. Okay, back into the oven at 400 degrees for another 10 minutes. See what the other one looks like. And this loaf of bread is beautiful as well. And even with gloves, these bread pans are hot. Now you see what I meant about having the edges of the parchment paper. Would have been nice to get the bread out. Okay, isn't that beautiful? Back into the oven. The sourdough bread has baked an additional 10 minutes at 400 degrees. Time to take it out of the oven and check the temperature. What we're looking for is an internal temperature of at least 200 degrees. Anything over 200 is fine. And the first one is 203. Perfect. And the other loaf is 202. Perfect. Now for the history and dimensions of the tools I used. Earlier this week, when I baked sourdough bread using cast iron bread pans for the first time, these are the only two bannetons I had. The one on the left with the flared out sides allowed the sourdough to expand too much to the side and was difficult getting the sourdough into the bread pan. The other banneton on the right with the narrower sides worked perfectly and produced this loaf of bread. Here are the dimensions of the banneton that worked best: 11 inches in length and 6 1/2 inches wide at the outside edge. And so I went to my local Bosch Kitchen Center looking for one more banneton 11 inches by 6 1/2 inches, but they didn't have one. They did have two bannetons slightly smaller, and I bought those. And they produced this sourdough bread I baked today. The dimensions of the two smaller ones are 10 inches in length and 6 inches wide at the outer edges. If there is a cooking or baking item you would like me to demonstrate through a video, please indicate on youtube.com in the comment section below this video, and I'll do my best to accommodate. Thanks again for watching, and make it a great day.